It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1983 when the front door of the old Harlan farmhouse swung open for the last time under the hand of Ray Cotter. He didn't slam it. That was what surprised her. After 3 weeks of arguments that shook the plaster dust from the ceiling, after dishes thrown and accusations hurled like stones, he simply walked out with a duffel bag over one shoulder and closed the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click. That quiet little sound was worse than any slamming could have been. It was the sound of a man who had already stopped caring enough to be angry. Josie Cotter, 28 years old, stood at the kitchen window and watched his taillights shrink down the gravel road that cut through 960 acres of eastern Nebraska bottomland. The fields on either side were still brown with the stubble of last year's corn, and a cold wind pushed a curtain of dust across the road behind his car until the red lights blinked out like dying embers. She stood there long after he was gone, her coffee growing cold in her hands, her breath fogging the glass. The silence that settled over the house was not the comfortable silence of a winter morning. It was the silence of an empty courtroom after a verdict has been read. Let me tell you what Ray left behind, because that is where this story truly begins. He left behind a 1967 International Harvester 1256, the farm's primary tractor, with a cracked head gasket that had been weeping coolant into the third cylinder for 6 weeks. He left behind a 4-row planter with a busted seed metering unit that threw corn into the ground in clumps or not at all. He left behind a grain dryer with a burner assembly so clogged with carbon that it hadn't fired since October, which meant 4,000 bushels of corn were still sitting in the bin at dangerous moisture levels, slowly spoiling. And he left behind a stack of bills on the kitchen counter, held down by a coffee mug, the top one stamped in red letters that needed no explanation. He also left behind something he probably never thought about because he never understood its value. He left behind everything Clayton Harlan had built. Clayton Harlan was Josie's father, and to understand this story, you need to understand him first. He was not a large man, but he had the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller when he walked in. He had farmed that same 960 acres since 1949, the year he came home from Korea with a piece of shrapnel in his left knee and a conviction that he would never again depend on anyone or anything he couldn't see with his own eyes and hold in his own hands. He distrusted credit the way some men distrust snakes, instinctively and completely. He had paid cash for every piece of equipment he ever owned, which meant his equipment was never new and never flashy, but it was his, and he knew every bolt and bearing in it the way a surgeon knows the anatomy of a heart. Clayton had died the previous autumn, a heart attack, sudden and final, in the machine shed on a Thursday afternoon. Josie found him sitting on an overturned bucket beside the old International, a grease gun still in his hand, as if he had simply decided to rest for a moment and never got back up. He looked peaceful, which was a small mercy. The larger mercy was that he never had to see what happened next, the slow unraveling of the son-in-law he had never fully trusted and the gathering storm that was about to break over every farmer in the county. Now, let me explain the world Josie was standing in that cold March morning. The early 1980s were the leading edge of the worst agricultural disaster since the Dust Bowl, but most people didn't know it yet. For the past decade, the gospel had been growth. The government, the land-grant universities, the bankers, and the equipment dealers had all sung the same hymn. Expand, borrow, modernize. Land values had doubled and tripled through the 70s. Russian grain deals and soaring exports had convinced everyone that the good times were a permanent condition, like gravity. Farmers mortgaged their paid-off land to buy more land, then mortgaged that land to buy the massive new equipment needed to farm it. The debt was staggering, But nobody blinked because the land itself was the collateral, and land only went up. Then, in the early 1980s, everything inverted. Interest rates, driven up by the Federal Reserve to crush inflation, hit levels that would have seemed like black comedy a few years earlier. 18%, 20%. At the same time, a grain embargo against the Soviet Union collapsed export markets. Commodity prices fell through the floor, and land values, that supposedly unshakable foundation, began to crumble. The farmers who had leveraged everything, the ones who had listened to the gospel of growth, were suddenly drowning. Their land was worth less than they owed on it. Their payments were calculated at interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. The bankers who had pushed the money across the desk were now pulling it back. But that storm was still gathering on the horizon that March morning. In Josie's kitchen, the crisis was immediate and personal. Ray had been the one Clayton never warmed to. He was a talker, a planner, a man who read farm magazines and circled the advertisements for new combines with a red pen. When Clayton was alive, Ray had been held in check by the old man's iron discipline. But after Clayton's death, with Josie grieving and the farm suddenly his to run, Ray had taken out an operating loan against the next year's crop. He had bought a used but expensive self-propelled combine on credit. He had talked about expanding, about renting the Driscoll quarter section to the north, and then, when the reality of actually running the place hit him, when the tractor broke and the planter jammed and the corn sat wet in the bin because the dryer wouldn't light, he had done what he always did when things got hard. He blamed someone else and left. The morning after Ray drove away, Josie went to town. Her first stop was the office of the Platte County Farm Credit Association, a low brick building on Main Street that smelled of carpet cleaner and quiet desperation. The loan officer was a man named Mr. Pemberton, mid-50s. Bifocals, a man who had spent his career in the comfortable middle ground between farmers and money. He knew Josie. He had known Clayton. He ushered her into his office with the practiced sympathy of a funeral director. "Josie," he said, settling into his chair, "I was sorry to hear about Ray. These are difficult times for a lot of families." She noticed he said, "difficult times," rather than "your husband left you," which she supposed was the professional version. "I need to know where we stand," she said. "All of it. The operating loan, the combine note, the crop insurance, everything." Mr. Pemberton opened a manila folder and laid out the numbers with the delicacy of a man defusing a bomb. The operating loan was $22,000. The combine carried a note of $48,000 at 16% interest. The crop insurance had lapsed a REIT because Ray had missed the premium payment. The 4,000 bushels of corn in the bin were losing value every day they sat at high moisture. The spring planting was 8 weeks away, and without a functioning tractor and planter, there would be no crop. And without a crop, there would be no way to service the debt. He closed the folder and looked at her over his bifocals. "There's a group out of Omaha," he said carefully. "Agricultural Investment Consortium. They're acquiring family operations, consolidating them into larger units. They're offering fair prices, in some cases above market. Given your situation, Josie, it might be worth a conversation. What are they offering?" "Enough to clear all your debts and leave you with a clean start. Maybe enough to put a down payment on a house in town." She sat with that for a moment. A house in town, a life measured in someone else's walls. "My father paid off that land in 1968, she said. "He never owed a dime on it after that. Not one dime. Ray took the loans out, not me and not my father." "I understand the sentiment, Josie, but sentiment doesn't service debt. You're a young woman alone on almost 1,000 acres, with broken equipment and no operating capital. The math doesn't work." "The math will work," she said. "I need 60 days. Mr. Pemberton removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. It was the gesture of a man who had heard this kind of desperate optimism before and knew how it usually ended. "I can give you 60 days," he said quietly. "But Josie, after that, the board will want a resolution." She drove home with the windows down despite the cold because she needed the air to think. 60 days. The corn had to be dried and sold. The tractor had to run. The planter had to work. And she had to do all of it alone because there was no money to hire help and no one left to ask. That night, she did something she had been avoiding since her father's death. She went into the machine shed and turned on the overhead fluorescents, the long tubes flickering and buzzing before flooding the concrete floor with pale blue-white light. The shed was Clayton's cathedral. His tools hung on pegboard along the back wall, each one outlined black marker so you could see at a glance if something was missing. His workbench was a massive slab of oak, scarred and stained but swept clean, because Clayton Harlan never left a dirty workspace. The air smelled of diesel and WD-40 and cold metal, and standing in that space, Josie felt her father's presence so strongly that she almost turned around to see if he was behind her. On the shelf above the workbench, lined up like volumes in a library, were his service manuals, thick, spiral-bound books for every machine on the place, their covers dark with handling, their pages tabbed with strips of masking tape on which Clayton had written notes in his small, square handwriting. Next to the manuals, in a wooden box that had once held shotgun shells, were his personal records. Not a notebook, but dozens of index cards, each one dedicated to a single machine, each one documenting every repair, every part number, every torque specification, every quirk and weakness, in chronological order going back decades. They were his memory, the farm's memory, written in pencil on 3x5 cards with the precision of a watchmaker's log. Josie pulled the card for the International 1256 and read it under the fluorescent light. The entries went back to 1967, the year Clayton bought it used from an estate sale in Columbus. She flipped through years of meticulous maintenance until she reached the last entry, dated 2 weeks before his death. Oct 4, noticed slight coolant loss, 3 area. Check head gasket at winter service. Torque, spec 85 feet OB, sequence inside out. Keep Fel-Pro gasket, set 8179 on hand. He had already diagnosed the problem. He had already told her what to do. He just hadn't lived long enough to do it himself. Have you ever had a moment where grief and gratitude hit you at the same time, so hard that you can't tell which one is making you cry? That was Josie, standing in her dead father's machine shed at 11 o'clock at night, holding an index card that contained the answer to a problem a room full of bankers said couldn't be solved. The next morning, she called the Napa Auto Parts store in Norfolk and ordered the gasket set. It cost $14.37. She picked it up that afternoon and spent the next 3 days in the shed with the International. She drained the coolant. She pulled the head, which on a diesel engine of that era is not a delicate operation. It involves breaking loose bolts that haven't moved in years. Bolts that fight you with rust and seized threads, bolts that strip your knuckles raw and test the limits of your vocabulary. She cleaned the deck surface with a razor blade and a can of brake cleaner, scraping away the old gasket material in thin, stubborn strips. She checked the head for warpage with a straight edge and a feeler gauge, just as the index card instructed, and found it within tolerance. She laid the new gasket, torqued the bolts in the sequence Clayton had written down, reconnected the coolant lines, and filled the system with fresh antifreeze. When she turned the key, the International shook itself awake like a dog coming out of water, coughed twice, and settled into a deep, steady idle. No white smoke, no coolant weeping from the gasket line. She sat in the cab with her hands on the wheel, grease under every fingernail, and let herself feel the vibration of the engine through the seat. It was the first thing that had gone right in months. The planter came next. The seed metering unit was a more complex problem, a precision mechanism designed to drop individual kernels at exact intervals. She found Clayton's card for the planter and followed it to a worn finger pickup wheel that was no longer grabbing seeds consistently. The part was discontinued by the manufacturer, but Clayton had noted on the card, backup finger wheel in parts bin, shelf 3, coffee can marked planter. She found the coffee can, she found the part. It fit perfectly. The grain dryer was the last and most urgent problem. 4,000 bushels of corn at 19% moisture was a ticking clock. It needed to be down to 15% to sell, and every day it sat wet was a day closer to spoilage. The burner assembly was clogged with carbon buildup from years of burning propane, a problem Ray had ignored because fixing it meant crawling into a tight, dark space and disassembling a unit that was designed by engineers who apparently hated the people who had to service their work. Josie spent an entire day inside that dryer, lying on her back on a piece of cardboard, cleaning carbon from the burner ports with a wire brush and a dental pick she'd found in a drawer of miscellaneous tools. Her arms ached. Her eyes stung from the chemical cleaner. She emerged covered in black soot and smelling like a chimney sweep. But the dryer lit, and when it lit, it roared to life with a heat that you could feel 20 feet away. She ran it for 9 straight days, checking the moisture levels every 4 hours with a handheld tester, sleeping in 2-hour stretches on the old couch in the farmhouse living room. With an alarm clock on the floor beside her, she hauled the dried corn to the elevator in the farm truck, a 1972 Chevrolet C60 with a 4-speed manual and a dump bed that groaned like an old man getting out of a chair. It took 11 trips. The elevator paid her $2.89 a bushel, which came to $11,560. She drove straight from the elevator to the farm credit office and handed Mr. Pemberton a check that covered the operating loan in full, with a little left over. He looked at the check, then at her. She was still wearing her work clothes. There was corn dust in her hair and a bruise on her forearm from where a wrench had slipped. "The planting," he said carefully. "You have seed? Fertilizer?" "I have seed from last year's holdback. My father always kept a reserve, and I'll side dress with what nitrogen I can afford after the crop is up, not before." He started to say something about the combine note, but she was already standing. 60 days, she said. We agreed. The spring planting was an exercise in endurance that Josie would remember for the rest of her life. She planted 640 acres of corn alone. Alone. Let me make sure you understand what that means. It means driving a tractor pulling a 4-row planter back and forth across fields that stretch to the horizon for 14, 16, sometimes 18 hours a day. It means stopping every few rounds to refill the seed boxes, climbing down from the cab with legs stiff as fence posts, hefting 50-pound bags of seed, and climbing back up again. It means checking the planter's performance constantly, walking behind it to make sure the depth is right, the spacing is right, the press wheels are closing the furrow properly. It means fixing things that break in the field, because things always break in the field, with whatever tools you have in the tractor's toolbox and whatever ingenuity you can summon through the fog of exhaustion. She ate sandwiches in the cab. She relieved herself behind the tractor because driving back to the house meant losing 20 minutes she didn't have. She talked to herself, to the tractor, to her father. "Keep turning, old girl," she'd say to the International, patting the dash when it coughed on a cold start. "Just get me through this field." The town watched. They had opinions. At the coffee shop on Main Street, at the feed store, at the co-op, where farmers gathered to talk weather and prices, The Harlan place was a regular topic. A woman alone, they said, running almost 1,000 acres with equipment that belonged in a museum. They gave her credit for stubbornness, but not for sense. The consensus, spoken with the resigned certainty of people who had seen enough hardship to know its rhythms, was that she would make it through planting, but not through harvest. The combine note alone would sink her. What they didn't talk about, because they didn't know, was the soil. Clayton Harlan had been practicing what would later be called conservation farming before the term existed. He rotated corn and soybeans religiously. He planted rye as a cover crop every fall after harvest, a practice his neighbors considered a waste of time and seed. He never plowed deeper than he had to, and in the years before his death, he had started experimenting with reduced tillage, leaving more residue on the surface to hold moisture and prevent erosion. His neighbors ran their fields bare and black, pouring on anhydrous ammonia to force production from depleted ground. Clayton's fields looked rougher, messier, less farmed by conventional standards. But the soil beneath them was dark and crumbly and full of earthworms, a living system instead of a chemical dependency. Josie continued every one of these practices, not because she had read about them in a magazine, but because her father had walked her through the reasoning since she was old enough to follow him into the field. "You see how this ground holds together when you squeeze it?" he would say, crumbling a fistful of soil between his fingers. "That's biology working. That's roots and worms and fungi building a house down there. The guys next door are burning that house down every year with the plow and the ammonia. They get a crop, sure, but they're spending $3 in inputs to make $4 in grain. We spend $1 to make $3. When the bad years come, and they always come, who do you think survives? The bad years came. By the summer of 1983, the farm crisis was no longer a rumbling on the horizon. It was an earthquake. Interest rates stayed brutal, commodity prices stayed low, and land values, the collateral underlying billions of dollars in farm debt, collapsed. In Josie's county alone, 17 farms went to foreclosure auction that year. 17 families who had done everything the experts told them to do, who had expanded and borrowed and modernized, watched their life's work sold on the courthouse steps to strangers. The emotional toll was beyond measuring. There were divorces, there were breakdowns. There were men who went into their barns and didn't come out alive. It was a catastrophe played out in quiet individual tragedies across the entire heartland. Josie's neighbor to the east, a man named Dean Lowell, who had farmed 3,000 acres with a fleet of new John Deere equipment, lost everything in August. She saw the auction from her kitchen window, a line of cars parked along the road, and a crowd of people standing in his yard, while an auctioneer's voice carried across the fields like the chant of a priest at a funeral. His four-wheel drive tractor, the one he'd bought for $85,000 on credit 2 years earlier, sold for $31,000. She watched Dean standing at the edge of his own crowd, hat in his hands, and she felt no satisfaction, only a cold, hollowing sadness. The combine note was the sword hanging over her head. $48,000 at 16%, a debt Ray had created, and she was left to carry. She couldn't pay it from 1 year's crop. She couldn't refinance it in a market where credit had dried up like a creek in August. The combine itself, a used Gleaner L2, sat in the machine shed like an expensive accusation. This is where Josie did something that revealed the depth of her father's teaching. She didn't panic. She didn't beg the bank for mercy. She calculated. The combine was worth, in that collapsed market, maybe $25,000. She owed $48,000. But the combine was also her only way to harvest 640 acres of corn, and without a harvest, she had nothing. So she went to Mr. Pemberton with a proposal. She would sell the combine immediately after harvest, apply the proceeds to the note, and negotiate a payment plan for the remaining balance, secured not by the land, which she refused to pledge, but by her future crops. Mr. Pemberton listened. He was listening differently now than he had in March. The operating loan was paid. The spring planting was done. The fields looked good. He had also, in the intervening months, watched a dozen borrowers default, and he had begun to develop a grudging respect for the accounts that were still current, however small. "Your father," he said slowly, "was the only farmer I ever knew who came in here and told me he didn't want a loan." "He told me the same thing," Josie said. "He said the day you need a banker is the day you've already lost." Mr. Pemberton winced slightly. He wasn't entirely wrong. They worked out the terms. It wasn't generous, but it was survivable. The harvest that fall was Josie's crucible. She ran the gleaner from the first day the corn was dry enough to cut until the last stalk was down. The machine was a temperamental beast, prone to plugging in heavy corn and throwing belts at the worst possible moment. She kept her father's index card for the gleaner taped to the sun visor in the cab, and every time it broke, she consulted it like scripture. Feeder chain tension, 1 2-inch deflection at midspan. Over-tight snap chain, under-tight plugged header. She replaced 2 belts, a hydraulic hose, and a shear pin in the field, working by the headlights of the farm truck in the dark, because every hour of delay was an hour closer to the weather turning. She finished the harvest on November 12th. The yield was 127 bushels to the acre, not a record, but solid and above the county average. Her input costs were 40% lower than her neighbors because she hadn't poured on expensive fertilizer and because she owned her tractor and planter outright. When she ran the numbers in the kitchen that night, by the light of the same lamp her father had used to do his books, she found that she had cleared enough to make the combine payment, cover her living expenses for the winter, and set aside a small reserve for spring. She was not getting rich. She was surviving, and in the Nebraska farm crisis of 1983, survival was a form of triumph that most people couldn't comprehend. Let me tell you about a night that winter. It was January, deep cold, the kind of cold that makes the nails in the walls pop and the timbers in the old house groan like a ship at sea. The furnace was running on propane, and propane was expensive, so Josie kept the thermostat at 58 degrees and wore 2 sweaters indoors. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going through her father's index cards, not for any practical reason, but because holding them made her feel less alone. His handwriting was there on every card, his small square letters, a kind of conversation across the silence. At the bottom of the box, beneath the last card, she found something she had never seen. It was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice, written in pencil. It was not a repair record. It was a letter, addressed to no one, dated 1971. If you are reading this, then the farm is yours now, and I am not here to walk you through it. I'm sorry for that, but I am not sorry for what I am about to say, because I have said it to you 100 times, and I will say it once more in writing so you cannot forget. The land is not yours. You are the land's. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. Do not let anyone tell you that bigger is better, or that new is smarter. Do not borrow against the future, because the future is the one thing you cannot predict. Trust your hands, trust your eyes, trust what you can see and touch and fix. And when the hard times come, remember that the ground beneath your feet has survived worse than anything you will face. Be patient, be stubborn, be honest. That is all I know, and it is enough. Josie read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her shirt pocket, close to her heart, where she carried it for the rest of that winter like a talisman. Spring came. She planted again. The corn grew. She sold the gleaner after harvest, took a loss and paid down the note. She bartered with a neighbor. doing mechanical work on his equipment in exchange for the use of his combine for 2 weeks each fall. It was an arrangement that would have made Clayton smile, two farmers trading skill for machinery. No cash, no bank, no paper trail, just a handshake and a mutual understanding that you help the people who could help you. By 1985, the combine note was paid in full. By 1987, Josie owed nothing to anyone. The farm was hers, free and clear, just as it had been her father's. And the land, that dark, worm-rich, carefully tended ground, was producing consistent yields with a fraction of the inputs her neighbors required. She was farming profitably on 960 acres, while operations twice her size were going under. The bankers noticed. The surviving neighbors noticed. The agricultural extension agents noticed. People began to use words like sustainable and conservation tillage and soil health, terms that would become fashionable in the decades to come, but that Clayton Harlan had simply called common sense. One afternoon in the spring of 1986, a familiar truck pulled into the yard. Josie was in the machine shed, repacking the wheel bearings on her planter, the parts laid out on a clean rag in the precise order she had removed them. She heard the engine and looked up. Ray Cotter got out of the truck. He was thinner than she remembered, and older than 3 years should have made him. The oil field work had not been kind. The boom had busted, just like farming, and the swagger that had once defined him had been ground down to something smaller and quieter. He stood by the truck with his hands in his pockets, looking at the farm. The fences were tight. The equipment was clean and parked in order. The fields beyond the shed were greening with the first shoots of a new crop. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "They told me in town," he said. "They said you paid everything off. The operating loan, the combine, everything." She waited. She had learned patience from the land and from her father, and she applied it to people too. "I drove past Dean Lowell's old place on the way here," Ray continued. "It's all one big corporate field now. No house, no barn, no trees. They bulldozed everything." "I know," she said. "I was so sure I was right, Josie." His voice cracked on her name. "I thought your dad was stuck in the past. I thought if we just got bigger, got modern, we'd be set. I thought the farm was holding us back." He looked at the ground. "But it wasn't the farm, it was me. I was the weak link. I couldn't do the work, so I blamed the tools." She didn't argue with him. There was no point and no cruelty in her silence. It was simply the truth, and they both knew it. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, "for leaving, for the debt, for not believing in you or your father." Josie wiped her hands on a shop rag and walked over to him. She didn't hate him. The years had burned away the anger and left behind something more like understanding. He had been a man caught in a fever that infected the entire country, and the fever had broken him. It had broken a lot of people. "My father used to say that the worst thing about debt isn't the money," she said. "It's that it makes you make decisions out of fear instead of sense." Ray nodded. His eyes were wet. "You can't come back," she said, and it wasn't harsh, just clear. "But I forgive you, and I hope you find your own ground to stand on." He left the same way he had come down, the gravel road, a plume of dust behind him. She watched him go, then went back to the planter. The bearing needed repacking. The grease had to be the right grade. The torque had to be exact. The work, as always, was the answer. Now, let me take you forward, because this story doesn't end in the 1980s. It ends, or rather it continues, on a September afternoon some 30 years later. Josie Harlan, as she has gone back to her maiden name, is 61 years old. Her face carries the map of 4 decades of sun and wind and cold. Her hands are strong and scarred and utterly capable. The farm is still 960 acres. She never expanded. She never borrowed. She invested in the soil, in cover crops and buffer strips, and a rotation that now includes corn, soybeans, oats, and clover. The farm is not the biggest in the county. It is, by every measure that matters, the healthiest. The old International 1256 still sits in the machine shed, its red paint faded to the color of a prairie sunset. She doesn't use it much anymore, having bought a modest newer tractor with cash in 1998. But she starts the International every month just to hear it run. It turns over with the same deep, confident rumble it has had since 1967. Beside it on the workbench, in the same wooden shotgun shell box, are Clayton's index cards. And beside those, in a newer box, are Josie's own cards, 30 years of her own meticulous records, written in a hand that is smaller and neater than her father's, but carries the same stubborn precision. On this particular September afternoon, she is not alone in the machine shed. With her is her daughter, Claire, 24, fresh out of the University of Nebraska, with a degree in agronomy, and a head full of data about soil microbiomes and carbon sequestration and precision agriculture. Claire is brilliant and modern and occasionally impatient with what she considers her mother's old-fashioned ways. But she is here on the farm, and that tells you everything about where her heart is. Josie is showing her the index cards. "Your grandfather started these in 1949, she says, fanning them out on the workbench like a hand of cards. Every machine, every repair, every part number. When the head gasket blew on the International, I didn't call a mechanic. I read his card, and it told me exactly what to do. A $14 gasket set saved a 10,000-pound tractor." Claire picks up a card and turns it over, reading the penciled entries. "You could put all of this in a database, Mom. Scan them, digitize the records, cross-reference by part number and failure mode. You could," Josie agrees. "And you should. But first, I want you to learn it this way, because a database can crash and a computer can break. But if you hold this knowledge in your hands and your head, nobody can take it from you. Not a banker, not a husband, not a drought, not a crash." She hands Claire a socket wrench and points to the wheel hub of the planter, the same planter she has maintained for 3 decades. "Before you tighten that," Josie says, "I want you to feel the bearing. Roll it between your fingers. Is it smooth or does it catch? Because the machine will tell you what it needs if you're quiet enough to listen." Claire kneels beside the planter, wrench in hand, and does as her mother says. The shed is quiet except for the soft click of the bearing turning in its race. Outside, the September sun is low and golden over the fields, and the corn, tall and heavy-eared and almost ready for harvest, sways in a wind that carries the faint, sweet smell of grain drying on the stalk. The men in town had said she would fail. The banker had offered her an exit. Her own husband had called the farm a millstone and walked away. But the farm is still here, and Josie is still here, and the soil, that dark, living, worm-rich earth that Clayton Harlan spent his life building and his daughter spent her life protecting, is still here, and now it is being handed, carefully and deliberately, to the generation that will carry it forward. The strongest thing on any farm has never been the size of its tractors or the balance in its bank account. It is the knowledge passed from one pair of calloused hands to the next, and the patience to trust that the land will answer the care you give it. The work, as Clayton wrote all those years ago on a folded sheet of paper at the bottom of a box of index cards, is the answer. It was always the answer.